God, for the sake of the prayers of the Most Pure Mother, of our Father among the saints, John of Shanghai and San Francisco, the patron of our Holy Temple, of the Holy Prophet, forerunner of Baptist John, and of all thy saints, have mercy upon us and save us, for he is good and loves mankind. Amen. So we're moving on in our series of feasts. We celebrated the cross. Earlier we celebrated the Nativity of the Mother of God, that is her birth. And now the next great feast in our cycle is actually called the entrance of the Theotokos into the Holy Temple. It's quite a large title. This is another feast that comes from the Proto-Evangelium of James, from ancient and holy tradition. And this feast is celebrated on November 21st. So now we're in this kind of period where there's not as many feasts close together. And so now we're beginning to bounce ahead to feasts that are further in advance of where we are now. So this is the great feast that directly precedes Christmas. This will happen on November 21st liturgically, Christmas on December 25th. And so there's a big gap in terms of major dogmatic feasts. And so I'll explain this icon to you briefly, and then we'll launch into discussing this. And so today we celebrate the conception of John the Baptist. When I spoke about John the Baptist, I mentioned that he has great feasts, like his beheading, his nativity, and also minor ones like his conception. We just celebrated his conception today and tomorrow. Zacharias obviously conceives him. This is Zacharias right here. So Zacharias is actually a relative, or I should rather say his wife Elizabeth is a relative of Anna's. He is the high priest. He is serving as the high priest at this moment in which Saint Joachim and Anna, after the Mother of God is born, they dedicate her to God. They can't have a child at all. This is just like Abraham. This is just like Hannah. Hannah especially dedicates Samuel directly to God. She can't have a child. She prays before the tabernacle, and Eli, the priest, thinks that she's drunk because she's kind of speaking silently. And Eli kind of says, "Oh, drunk woman, why are you here?" He sends one of the Levites to go tell her, "Drunk woman, can you be drunk somewhere else? Why do you have to be drunk in the tabernacle?" And she starts crying. She says, "I'm not drunk. I'm sad that I don't have a child." And then Eli says, "Oh, woman, may God give you what you need." And she has a child. And so she dedicates him entirely to God, and that's where we get the prophet Samuel. The same thing happens here. The parents, Joachim and Anna, bring the Theotokos directly to the temple, basically to make an offering for her. They bring her to the temple and give her directly to God. The temple is God's house, and so there's no other way to give her to God except by bringing her to the temple. Zachariah receives her, and he actually takes her into the Holy of Holies. And at this time, there is no ark. We've talked about the Mother of God being the ark a lot. We've talked about this a lot. There is no ark in the Holy of Holies right now, because from the time of Jeremiah onward, the ark has been missing. Where is it? I don't know. The Ethiopians claim they have it. Indiana Jones has another story. And there are some people who believe the Indiana Jones story, that the Egyptians took it and took it back to Egypt and it was buried in the city of Tanis. Others believe that the Jews hid it somewhere in the temple or somewhere at Golgotha or these different places. The Jews themselves hid it because their kings were so diabolical. They were sacrificing unclean things. They were bringing idols into the Holy of Holies. And so the pious Jews said, we need to get the holy things out of here before the kings do something really bad.
Do you think that's plausible since there was the true cross underneath a church, or it was buried or something?
To be honest with you, I don't know. The Ethiopians seem to have a lot of evidence that they possess the ark. And there's been many people who testified having seen things. And actually, from what I understand, the Ethiopians do not consider the box to be the ark. They actually consider the two tablets of the Ten Commandments to be the ark. And so when Americans would go and talk to the Ethiopians would talk about seeing the ark. Like these very old priests would talk about seeing the ark. They say the ark is like, this big. And I said, what do you mean the ark is that big? The ark is this much bigger thing that Moses made, what Indiana Jones showed. And they're like, oh, no, that's not the ark. The ark is the tablets of stone Moses made. That's what we mean. It's hard to say. That tradition you said that Adam was buried at Golgotha, that is a tradition many Holy Fathers actually speak about. Is it true? I don't know, but there are Holy Fathers who accept this, or they speak about this. And I think St. Ambrose does, maybe St. Basil the Great also does. So there are some Fathers that talk about what you said. I know that some Protestants believe the Ark of the Covenant is also there.
Yeah.
So that the blood of Christ drips onto it, and makes atonement. I'm not sure that's necessary. But when I was in the Holy Land, what I can say about this is that I went to the Temple Mount. Jews are not allowed to go up on the Mount because of the fact that the Muslims control that part of Jerusalem, and there is the Al-Aqsa Mosque is on top of it, and also the Dome of the Rock. But they would allow people to go underneath it. And so I went underneath the Temple Mount. There's a whole series of passages underneath the Temple Mount that show the menagerie of that time. So when Herod reinforced the Temple Mount, they took very large stones that maybe weighed 22 tons apiece. And these stones were, 30 feet long or 20 feet long, I don't know how many feet wide. And these stones were so big that they weighed many tons. So how did they move them? They moved them through pulleys and through different systems that they used. But they slammed these stones together so tight you can't put a piece of paper between them.
Or the Songs of Solomon talks about how they're done.
That's how good.
There's apocryphal.
Oh, the
apocryphal where Jesus
miraculous.
says the legends, yeah.
these stones are there, and you can go through the chambers underneath the temple, and there's all these passages and things underneath. And I bumped, as we were going through, we saw these Jewish women that were praying in this kind of particular corner. And our guide, who is a Protestant, she was a Jewish woman, but she's Protestant, she became a Messianic kind of Jew. She basically said those women probably believe the Ark of the Covenant is behind that wall, as in the Ark of the Covenant is somewhere hidden in these lower depths of the temple. And so she said these women are likely praying because they believe the Ark is somewhere there. And of course we continued. And so where the Ark is very hard to say. We don't really know. But in any case, St. Paul confirms this in the Epistle of the Hebrews, that the Ark, he's speaking about the accoutrements of the Holy of Holies, and he says, of this we can no longer speak in detail. These things are gone. Now there's 2 cherubim in the Holy of Holies, but there's nothing in between them anymore, because the Ark is gone. Saint Zechariah is completely overcome by the Holy Spirit, and he takes this girl, and he leads her into the Holy of Holies. This is according to Holy tradition. And so the Mother of God enters the Holy of Holies. And why is this important? Why does this matter? Well, this matters because she is the actual Ark. We've already talked about this, so I'm not going to go through the symbolic imagery of the Old Testament too much, because I've already spent a long time telling you about it. But let's just say that in this feast is fulfill that entire concept. God has made God, allowed Moses to make the tabernacle. Then he allows David to prepare the temple. He allowed Solomon to build the temple. But now what is happening? The real temple is coming, because God doesn't want to live in houses made by men's hands. He wants to live inside of the souls of men. We have temples today because we need a place for men to gather. We also need a place for the holy gifts to be kept. And we have an altar that we offer sacrifice on. So we still need a physical temple. And God is physically present here in the mysteries. However, what God deeply desires is that every single heart should be his temple. And so the Mother of God is the beginning of this process. So she is brought into the Holy of Holies, and she dwells in the Holy of Holies, not exclusively. She enters it. And then she lives on the temple precinct with other virgins, and they are performing various functions. Like they're weaving, like she actually, according to tradition, she weaves the veil between the Holy of Holies and the rest of the holies, the rest of the inner court, because they need to replace this veil every once in a while because it just gets corroded. And so she actually weaves it. That's one of her jobs as a virgin, is she's working the temple weaving this. Why does she have to move away to get married? Well, she enters into her menstrual period. And once this period begins, the Jews don't want her in the temple anymore, because now she needs to go and get married. So she's kind of booted out of the temple at this time. The Pharisees want her gone. They want her out of the temple. So she doesn't want to leave, but the Pharisees are like, you're going to leave, and that's how it's going to be. And so that's where Joseph becomes her betrothed. Joseph is this man selected to be her guardian after she is removed from the temple. So she spends maybe 10 years in the temple. She comes into the temple when she's 3. According to Holy tradition, she actually climbs the final steps herself. She's not carried up. She actually does this herself. And then Zechariah leads her in to the Holy of Holies under the guidance of the Spirit, because otherwise he would never have done this, because it would have violated the law on so many levels. But the law is overcome in this manner, because this is the actual Ark. A Jew who understood only Moses' law would be baffled by this, but once everything is done, it's very clear why this was done. The Mother of God gives birth to Christ when she's about 15. This is actually according to Holy tradition also. She lives a period of time with Joseph. I'm not sure when she leaves the temple exactly, at what age she is, but she's probably in the temple about 10 years, something like this.
Yeah, what was the age of Joseph? I've heard different ages, that he was like 80, some 50.
Joseph
the
is
Romans
about,
like to put him as 20.
Joseph is about 80, and so the truth is there's
Yeah.
a belief that Joseph, there's different traditions about how old Joseph is when he dies.
He died
Joseph-
before the temple, right? I think there was a point after the temple that he wasn't there to, I forget something, so he died before Jesus got to his age of...
Yes, he definitely had reposed before Jesus began his ministry.
yeah.
There's different traditions that he died at the age of 110, or if he died at the age of, was it 100? Depends. He might have died either right before Jesus begins his ministry, which means he lived to be about 110. Some traditions say he died at the age of 100, which means Jesus was about 20 when he reposed. What we can say is that Joseph, as an 80-year-old man, led the Virgin Mother into Egypt and did everything for her. As an 80-year-old man, he worked. He toiled as a carpenter. He didn't stop working. He took care of her even in his agedness. And so, did Joseph ever kind of rest? No. Joseph had a previous marriage that had ended in widowhood, and from this came all the sons, the brothers, and the quote-unquote brothers and sisters of Christ. Of the brothers of Christ, only James believed in him completely. Only James did. If we read the book of John, Gospel of John, it talks about his brothers kind of like razzing Christ a little bit, saying to him, "Oh, why don't you go and show yourself to the world? This is what you should do." And Christ kind of spurns them a little bit. The brothers that are mentioned in this case do not include James. James never doubted Christ. His other brothers did. And so the brother Jude that we have, who wrote the book of Jude did doubt Christ, doubted him completely. However, he was made an apostle by Christ, and so Jude would never call himself brother of Christ. He would say, "I'm the brother of James." Because James, he said, "James is holy, I'm not." James always believed in him. I didn't believe him. I doubted him. Jude actually spent the rest of his life in deep humility, saying, I didn't believe the Messiah. I believed him later, but I didn't believe in him, right away. I doubted him for a long time. James didn't. So according to, you'll see some icons of James going with Joseph into Egypt. So it could actually have been Joseph, James, the mother of God, and the baby Jesus going into Egypt. That also may have been, because there are some traditions that James went with them, as in he also labored with his father, helping them maintain everything. And they spent a number of years in Egypt, actually.
I've also heard too that one was James's cousin. I heard another tradition; it was his half brother from the first marriage. Which one does the East teach? I've heard different traditions.
Well, the problem is in the West is that we have multiple Jameses. So, for example, if we read the Gospels, we have 2 apostles of the 12 that were James: James the son of Alphaeus and James the son of Zebedee, the brother of John the theologian. Some people try to say that James the son of Alphaeus, who's also the brother of Matthew, is actually the writer of the Epistle of James. The East has never accepted this. We do not believe this is true at all. So we believe there are 3 Jameses. There's James, the brother of John the theologian, James, the brother of Matthew, the tax collector, and there's James, the son of Joseph. And these are 3 separate Jameses. And so we consider there are 3, not just 2, but 3. And so there's some confusion actually between the East and the West about these matters, about, obviously they agree how many apostles there are, but who they actually are, there's some disagreement. And so James, the James that we're talking about, James, the son of Joseph, he becomes the bishop of Jerusalem. He's the one that's mentioned in Acts of the Apostles. He's the one that's mentioned, in the scriptures as being the leader of Jerusalem. So when Paul says, I talked with James, he means James, the son of Joseph. Now Jude, on the other hand, who doubted Christ, becomes one of the 12 apostles. James is not one of the 12 apostles. He never becomes one of the 12. He's only a mere bishop of Jerusalem. So his brother who doubted is actually, in a sense, higher than him. It's very interesting. Now James, the brother of Christ, the son of Joseph, was intense. He never touched meat. He never cut his hair. He may never have bathed, in the sense that he became a permanent Nazirite. So he was living this intense life. He was absolutely celibate. His knees were calloused. They said his knees looked like camel's knees because he kneeled on them on the stone of the temple. He would go into the temple and kneel for hours. And so his knees became really kind of calloused and intense. St. Jerome, basically writing about James, says that the Jews murdered James, the brother of Christ. They threw him off the roof of the temple. This was after the death of Christ already. They took James up to the top of the temple and they said, you're very powerful in this community. He was very respected. They said, you need to tell the people that he's not the Messiah. You need to say this. And he said, I'm not going to say this. And they threw him off the temple. The Pharisees pushed him off the roof of the temple at the command of the high priest. And then what happened was the Jews were so enraged with him that someone took a club and bashed his brains across the streets of Jerusalem. So his head exploded and his brains were sprayed across the pavements of Jerusalem. Now, shortly after they murdered James, the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem. They just sacked Jerusalem and they killed almost everyone in the city and enslaved everyone. St. Jerome says, very interestingly, that some of the Jews were so reverent towards James that they believed that because the Pharisees murdered him, that's why the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem. That's what some Jews believe. They said, oh my goodness, it's because we murdered him that the Romans came. It actually was because of Christ. So if you actually study things carefully, the Romans sacked Jerusalem 40 years after Christ's death. So God is so merciful, he gave the Jews 40 years to repent for the murder of Christ before he came and brought wrath upon them. And Christ foretells the destruction of Jerusalem in the Gospels. In multiple places he says this. And so the destruction of Jerusalem is something he already had foretold. Stephen himself, the Jews are claiming that Stephen is foretelling the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, he kind of is. I'm sure he is, because he would have known. In any case, we're getting off topic from this feast.
Seems like a regular thing, man.
It's okay. I know, but it's important to spread knowledge in every possible way. And so, any other questions about any of these things before we go back to the feast?
Is that a picture of an old icon? It looks like it's...
This is a print, yeah, this would be a print of an old icon. This is probably a print from, this might possibly have been done by Theophanes the Cretan, who's a very famous iconographer. This might possibly be a set with the iconostasis icons that we have. I don't know, actually, I'd have to see. So this is Zachariah receiving the Theotokos. The Theotokos is ascending the stairs by herself to go to Zacharias. And these are, obviously, Joachim and Anna bringing her. And these are all the virgins of the temple that are greeting her with their candles lit. And obviously angels are here. This is the angel visiting the Theotokos and bringing her bread, bringing her sustenance. One of the ways the monastics understand the Theotokos in the Holy of Holies is that she's engaging Hezekiah in absolute silence. Like she enters the Holy of Holies, and when she's in the Holy of Holies, she's living this life in which all of her thoughts become congruent with God. And so the Mother of God is living in the state of absolute Hezekiah. Hezekiah means silence. And what this means is basically that in the East we seek silence. Not silence of this, but silence of the mind. As in, we seek to stop our thoughts and to have our minds go to God.
Through the Jesus prayer?
Yes, the Jesus prayer is a method by which Hezekiah is attained. The Psalms are also methods by which Hezekiah is attained. But the point is that we want to heal our minds from their fractured state, in which our minds are constantly subject to thoughts, to intrusions, to all kinds of problems. And so many of the Holy Fathers, even the great Noetic Fathers, the fathers of the heart, the Neptic Fathers, the fathers of silence and watchfulness, they always would look at this feast and they would talk about this as being a kind of example of Hezekiah, an image of this hesychastic reality that monks want to have. St. John Maximovich, the patron of this church, this was his favorite feast day. He loved this feast the most. This is also a feast of monasticism because this is when the Mother of God is brought to the Holy of Holies and she is given completely to God. This is a symbol of monastic life. A man or a woman vows themselves to God and they become completely his in every single way. This is when the Mother of God is brought by her parents and given to God, literally in his temple, and she becomes his entirely. And so this feast also has deep monastic connotations, and so a lot of monastics very much reverence this feast. You will find churches named for this feast, maybe monasteries also dedicated to this feast, and so this feast will be a feast of the Theotokos. We will wear blue for the duration of the feast. The feast will always fall on November 21st. However, on the old calendar, that means in December, in terms of the new and the old combined. And so this is the feast that comes right before Nativity in terms of the great feasts.
How old was she when she entered the temple?
3. She was brought to the temple at the age of 3. Of course, Joachim had already done all the things with the law, right? As soon as when a child opens the womb, this child is also brought to the temple and redeemed. That's what happens between the Mother of God and Christ. They had already brought her to the temple in order to offer her to God in the sense that she's the child that opens the womb. Well, of course, it's the males that open the womb for which this is more important. But there's a kind of redemption. So she would have passed, Anna would have passed through her, I think with a girl, 80 days, actually not 40, 80 for girls, 40 for boys. So that had already happened. But now they're honoring their vow to God, saying, God, if you give us a child, we'll give her to you. So with Samuel the prophet, what happens to him? Hannah, his mother, brings him to the tabernacle and gives him to Eli. Samuel becomes Eli's protege. He serves under Eli. He becomes a priest under Eli. In a sense, Anna is doing the same thing that Hannah did in the Old Testament, and that is to bring her daughter, her one and only daughter, to God.
Is the Theotokos, when she's little, is she depicted as like older, like our Lord is in icons?
Well, she's depicted always wearing her garments. So she, even though she's 3 in this case, she is depicted wearing the garments that we see her in all her other images. So this is so no confusion arises.
Yeah.
We don't want anyone to misunderstand who's being depicted here. So she is depicted wearing the same clothing that she always does because she's always a virgin, she's always given to God, and she's always in this condition, and so her clothing never changes. The only difference with her clothing is that sometimes she can be depicted in red, that's very often, and sometimes in blue. That also can happen as well. I think more often it is red. Where that tradition of depicting the Mother of God with blue, or blue being indicative of her, I do not know when this tradition has come about.
How far back does this feast day go?
It goes back quite a ways. We have writings about this from St. Gregory of Nyssa, that is the brother of St. Basil the Great, writing in the 300s about this feast.
Okay.
So this feast is old. The reality of this feast, the knowledge of this event is from the apostolic times. The formality of its total celebration may have been formalized a little bit later. But the idea that the apostles knew the Theotokos went to the temple, that's pretty clear from the ancientness of the proto-evangelism of James. So that's very old. But formalizing this into a feast, like for example, what year did the conception of John the Baptist become a feast? Obviously from the Bible we know John the Baptist is conceived by the command of God. When does the church decide to make this into a feast day? That could be later. You know what I mean? But that event, of course, is biblical, so we know it happened.
Why are there 2 pictures of her though?
This is depicting different events. So this icon right here is depicting her entrance into the temple, which is the key reality. Mm-hmm. However, this is depicting her being fed by angels in the Holy of Holies, which is another aspect of this feast, that she was attended to by angels. So the angels actually came to her and attended her because here's the thing you have to think about. The Ark of the Covenant sits between the 2 cherubs, right? This is what Moses is commanded to do. So when Solomon builds the temple, they do the same thing. They follow the same pattern. She's in the temple attended by angels. The angels that surround the Ark are now surrounding her, except not the angels of gold, or the cherubs of gold that right. Moses made, but the actual angels themselves from heaven do this.
Okay.
And so this is key because you have to understand, everything in the Old Testament is an image of the new. It truly is. Every single thing is. There could be no other ark except the Mother of God, and so the Mother of God is greater than whatever came before. She's much greater than the ark of the Old Testament. She's much greater than what Moses had fashioned. Moses was following a prototype given to him by God, but that prototype really was an image of her. And this fits entirely. Again, we can go back through that symbology again, but I think I've done it so much that I think it should register deeply within you. So there's no disparity between the Old and the New Testaments. This is something we got to get over. Some Protestants have issues with it. Other Protestants are dispensationalists. They're a little bit different. But there is no divergence between the Testaments. It's simply that there's a time before grace and there's a time after. The time before is the preparation for the coming of this grace, the coming of this salvation. What comes after is the fulfillment of everything that was prophesied. And so there was prophecies that the prophets made by direct ear, that God gave them words like, thus saith the Lord, here's his prophecy. But many of the prophets prophesied through action, right? The actions the prophets did were prophecies of what would come. As I said when we were celebrating the cross, when Moses parts the Red Sea, this is a symbol of the cross. Moses is doing this with the cross. Moses takes the cross, and his staff represents the cross, and he does this, and he parts the Red Sea, and he brings it down again. By his staff, he kills Pharaoh. By the cross, Satan is killed. He's defeated. We can go through all that symbology. That's what I talked about last Wednesday. But basically, Moses is doing prophecy without saying anything. Prophecy isn't just words. It's the actions that are being done that demonstrate what will come. And so many prophets, King David, many people actually acted out prophecy. They acted it out. Sometimes, most of the time, probably without knowing it fully, what they were doing.
Did you say it was James who recorded this?
Well, the document upon which this is written is called the Proto-Evangelium of James. That's what it's called. If James was the author, I actually do not know if he was the author. But in any sense, that is what the document is called. And so it perhaps is ascribed to him. But in any case, this comes from the earliest parts of the church.
And this would be the Jews that are still faithful that record things like this?
This is holy tradition, and so this would come down. How do I say it to you? You have to realize that Zachariah and Elizabeth, the mother of God, they're all from one family.
Yeah.
Their family is bound up with the Messiah inextricably, right? How do I say this to you? Christ and John the Baptist are cousins, or they're second cousins. They're actually quite close to each other. In fact, I think the mother of God and John the Baptist are cousins. And so they're relatives. They're actually close relatives. The reality of this teaching resides within this actually quite a narrow reality.
That makes more sense.
That's how the truth is not really lost. It's maintained.
When Mary is presented into the temple, this upper depiction right here, she's in the temple and she's being fed by the angels, right? So how long was she in the temple for?
Well, you have to understand, she didn't spend all these years living in the Holy of Holies. She lived among the virgins of the temple. So there was a court. So the temple, you have to understand, the temple is a massive complex. I don't know if you've ever seen images of the temple of Herod was a massive place. It was a massive series of buildings. The temple had all these storerooms. They had to store wine. They had to store water. They had to store all these hooks, all these vessels for all the sacrifices they would perform. They had to store wood for burning sacrifices. They had to store all kinds of things. The temple was a massive complex. Part of this complex included a place for virgins to stay in the outer court. So if the Pharisees had known what was going on here, they would have exploded. They would have gone crazy. They would have been insane, right? They would have said, you took a child into the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies is for priests only. And not just priests, not even priests.
The high priest.
Only the high priest can go in. And so they would have blown their minds. But the thing about it is that the Pharisees themselves are not allowed into the temple. They're not allowed into the inner courts of the temple. They can go to the court of the men, but they cannot proceed into the actual altar, into the actual holy place. And then beyond the holy place is the Holy of Holies. And so Zechariah kind of had this freedom to do what he wanted because no one would be able to stop him. No one would be able to see. You know what I mean? And so the Pharisees didn't know this. No one knew that this had happened. Because had they known this would have created a massive pandemonium.
So
there was a court for virgins. So there's a court for women, and there was probably, I don't want to say a barracks. That's not a nice way of putting it.
What do you mean court?
What?
What do you mean court?
Well, the temple is a huge thing. It's a huge complex. And so the court of women is a place where women were allowed to go into. The court of the men was a place where men were allowed to go into. So there's different parts of the area in which women and men could not really mix inside the temple grounds. If you go to the Wailing Wall even to this day, there's a part for women and there's a part for men.
So when you say court, is it kind of similar to like a monastery?
The temple is surrounded by a wall. So the temple is actually walled around it. So the temple is a complex that you can only get into through the main gate. So no one can just go up to the temple and walk up to it. You actually have to go through this gate to enter it. And there may even be a series of gates that guide you to different places. And so the temple was a kind of guarded institution. They would make sure no Gentiles could get in because that would be an abomination. And so if some Roman said, hey, I'm going to go into the temple, they'd be like, whoa, you can't go into the temple. That's not going to happen. There was a place where virgins were actually kept and were staying in this area near the temple. But again, for the Jews, these virgins would not be virgins for life. They were virgins, probably until puberty, and then they would leave. They would go get married. They'd live the lives of normal Jewish women. But they were girls from pious families that had made offerings to God, and they had made an offering of their own children to God. But this, again, that was not permanent. The Pharisees did not want it to be permanent. So
when they made an offering of their children to the temple, would their children live in the temple?
Yes.
Okay.
So those girls, the girls that were virgins of the temple, lived on station in the temple. They didn't live in the holy parts of the temple. The parts of the temple that were forbidden to women, they were living in an outer portion of the temple that women would have been allowed to access. So therefore, these virgins that were in the temple would not have violated any laws. You know what I mean? Okay. They would not have caused any kind of concern or issues based upon where they were. Now, Mother of God going to the Holy of Holies would have caused absolute concern among all Jews who would not have been aware of what that signified. So she did not spend her entire time in the Holy of Holies, but she spent some time there.
So you said this is why it's like a monastic feast or like a sort of thing?
Well, like I said, this feast has its direct dogmatic significance, but it also has other significance depending upon how you interpret it, right? So
Yeah,
monastics will take an interpretation from this. Yes, absolutely.
Did the Jews have any form of monasticism like this, or was it just up to a certain point?
The Jewish conception is that marriage is the path that God has established for mankind. There are these odd figures like Elijah. I say odd because Elijah did not represent the typical path of Jews, right? Elijah was celibate. That's unusual. Moses was married. Everyone is married.
John the Baptist, would that...
Right. John the Baptist is celibate. John the Baptist won't eat meat. John the Baptist won't drink wine. In fact, the Pharisees think he's possessed by demons. That's actually what the Pharisees think about John the Baptist. So they totally misread John the Baptist. They don't understand him.
I mean, they misread a lot, but...
So,
Pharisees are retarded.
so basically a Nazarite would take a vow for like a period of time. It wasn't that he would take a vow forever. It'd be like it would be like, God saved his life from some kind of situation. He prayed, he was saved, and he said, okay, I'm going to honor God by shaving my head and growing out my hair, and then basically living without alcohol, maybe not having sex with women. I mean, if he was married, he might forego marriage, forego his marital unions for a while, and then he would not eat meat. So he would do some of these things that were ascetical, but he would do them for a time. This was not ever seen as being a permanent vow that you would make. Someone like James lived in a state of permanent vows, which was not, he just continued his vows, he just maintained them. Right? It wasn't that he went somewhere and said, I formally choose to be this way. This is just a personal thing James, the brother of Christ, did. John the Baptist is in the same position. He's living as a permanent Nazarite. That's why his hair is really long, his beard is really long. He's living in this really intense state. He's out in the desert. This is how he's living. And so some of the Essenes who moved out to live with John the Baptist and followed him, they might have lived in a pattern of life similar to his. But I don't know if they were maintaining permanent celibacy. That was very unusual for Jews. It was something the Jews really did not do. Among pagans, permanent celibacy was not followed either. Even the temple virgins that the pagans had would eventually leave the temple and get married. They were not under permanent vows to be celibate their whole life. That was just not something pagans did.
So John's a model for like the desert father.
Absolutely. John the Baptist and Elijah are both absolute demonstrations of monastic life. That is exactly how they are seen.
Are the Essenes celebrated as proto-monastics?
The Essenes are incredibly mysterious. What we know about the Essenes is hard to understand. We piece together little bits about them archaeologically and from the record. But the Essenes seem to have been connected to the desert, potentially to John the Baptist.
Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls are connected to the Essenes. The problem is the Essenes are not deeply understood in a deep way. The Pharisees are the primary ones we know, so are the Sadducees, but the Essenes are more mysterious. And so what I'll say to you about Judaism is don't have in your mind that Judaism in the time of Christ is like this monolithic thing. Yeah. Judaism is a racial thing. We're all, we may all be Jews, we're all circumcised, but like the beliefs of all the Jews were not the same. You had some Jews who said only Moses is good, everything after Moses was not good, or it's not true. Then you have the Pharisees who said, no, all the prophets are good, angels are good, all this stuff is good. Then you have the Essenes who may even have had other books that they would have had as well. Then you had Jews that were following the pseudepigraphical books, Enoch, Jubilees, some of these other texts. They were reading these books and considering them to be true.
Is it
right?
Because of their tribes?
Not necessarily. The Pharisees were not based on tribes. They were based on belief. And so there's men of all tribes that were involved in the Pharisees. So don't break things down on the base of tribes. That's not really correct. It's based upon association. And then you had Jews who were living in Galilee and some of these regions who might have been impious. They might have actually gone into they might have mixed with pagans. They might have started doing pagan things. They were embracing Greek culture. I mean, when the Greeks conquered that region, there were some Jews who tried to undo their circumcision so they would not be seen as being Jewish. But they saw that was bad. So they started eating pork. They started eating unclean things. They started sacrificing to idols. They basically became paganized Jews because they wanted to fit in with Rome, fit in with the Greeks, fit in with all these pagan conquerors who had conquered them. The Jews were not a monolithic thing. You also had Jews who moved away into the diaspora, who were living in Greece, living out throughout the world, trying to maintain their Jewish life somehow, even though they lived far from Jerusalem.
Or the Jews in Rome that Paul preached to.
Yeah, there was Jews even as far as Rome. And so there were Jews who they had synagogues, they'd read from the Bible, from the Old Testament, they would pray, and they would try to go to Jerusalem every once in a while to offer sacrifice and to continue their Jewish life. But it was difficult for the Jews that were abroad. Jews in Alexandria had a huge Jewish population, massive Jewish population. And then it had this population for a long time.
Is the Jewish population that Ethiopia has, is that maintained from the Old Testament days, maybe? Or?
Possibly. I mean, the Ethiopian tradition is
totally different religion, though. It's not even the same religion as the Israelite religion.
There's a whole bunch of mixtures. I mean, the truth is that
I'd imagine if it's anything like the Tewahedo, like the Ethiopian church, it'd be similar in that way.
I mean, the Ethiopians have this view that basically when the Queen of Sheba, who was Ethiopian, went to Solomon, they had sex, she conceived a child from Solomon, went back to Ethiopia and had this child. And so there's a kind of sense in which they have a claim that even their royal line comes from Solomon. That's what they claim. Is that true? I don't know if that's what they believe. But all I will tell you is that there's a massive Jewishness in Ethiopia. Very. When I was on Masada, this famous Jewish landmark, when I was in Israel, there was a Ethiopian family having a bar mitzvah. A whole bunch of Ethiopian Jewish boys were having their bar mitzvah on Masada. And so there's a very large Jewish presence within Ethiopia. Very large. And actually the Ethiopian heretics, the Christians there, are deeply, deeply, deeply affected by this. They may keep all the Jewish dietary laws. They have replicas of the Ark of the Covenant in their churches. And so they have a very odd Judaizing kind of religion. It's very interesting. So they did not maintain the Catholic universal Orthodox positions on many things. And so that's a sign that they waffled kind of into heresy.
This feast is in December or November?
So November is the liturgical day. Yeah.
Okay.
The actual, so November 21st would be December, is it 4th? On the new calendar. So liturgically this feast is celebrated November 21st, but in terms of how that lines up with the Gregorian calendar, with the new calendar, this would come out to be December 4th. But let me just make sure of that real quickly for you. Yes?
Theotokos being in the temple.
Yes?
I just remember hearing on the feast of the presentation of the Lord
Yes.
in the temple that there's a tradition that Zacharias knew that the Theotokos was a virgin still, and so when they were there, he had her stand with the virgins.
Yes, that's true. So Zacharias, when she comes to take the baby Jesus, to dedicate him, which is what the law commands, because he's the child that opens the womb, Holy tradition says that when she shows up at the temple, Zacharias, even though she has a child and she is betrothed to Joseph, he knows what's really going on, and so he actually takes her and has her stand with the virgins. And the Pharisees see this. This is actually done openly. I mean, they see this woman with the baby standing among the virgins, and the Pharisees are really ticked. They're really ticked off at Zacharias. And some people claim that Zacharias, part of his death comes from this action, that Zacharias is murdered. The truth is that Herod murders him because he won't give up John the Baptist, because John the Baptist and Christ are not far apart in their births. And so when Herod commands all the babies to be killed, that would include John the Baptist, and he knows that Zacharias had a baby because it's kind of well known. Right? Zacharias should never have had a baby. He's way too old. Elizabeth is way too old. They should never have had children. And so John is kind of a famous baby. Herod knows about it, and Herod says to John, he says to Zacharias, I want your baby. He has to die. And Zacharias says, I'm not going to give him to you. I serve God. I don't really care what you say. And then, Herod commanded that he be killed. And it's likely also but Christ accuses, both if we read the Gospels, Christ lays the blame of Zacharias' death on the Pharisees, actually. He says, upon you is all the righteous blood of the entire earth, from Abel all the way until Zacharias, the son of Barachias, whom you, Christ says to the Pharisees, whom you killed between the altar and the temple. And according to tradition, Zacharias' blood is sprayed across the floor of the temple, and it actually hardens on contact with the stone. It becomes as hard as the stone is. And so it's like his blood can never be swept out of the temple. It can never be washed out of the temple. God is so angry with what they've done that he leaves Zacharias' blood in the temple as a mark against them forever, until the temple is destroyed. And so in this case, it would seem that though Herod may have ordered it, the Pharisees probably liked it and really consented to this because they were very angry with him about all these other things. And so they may even have been the ones who killed him. I don't really know, but they were a part of it. They played a part in this. Part of it was Herod, part of it was them. The Pharisees seem to have gone along with Herod on a number of things.
They had a lot of anger towards him.
They had a lot of anger towards everybody.
They
had a lot of anger towards everybody. Anyone who was righteous, the Pharisees seem to have hated. And so they didn't like John the Baptist. They didn't like his dad. They didn't like his mother. They didn't like Christ. They did not like Christ's mother either, the Theotokos. The Pharisees didn't like anybody. They were very, very grumpy towards all good people.
Even Jesus said they didn't like his father. They said he had a different father.
Yep. And actually that statement is implying that they believe he's a bastard, is what that actually means. When they say, where's your father? What they're actually saying to Christ is, you are a bastard, is what they're actually saying to him.
No doubt why he called them hypocrites all the time.
Right, and so the Pharisees were pretty harsh. Some of the things they say to him are actually harsher than what people may realize.
You said earlier about Hezekiah.
Okay,
so you were talking about Hezekiah.
I'll accept this. Okay.
And then you said some people use the Psalms and some people use the Jesus prayer. And I was just curious because I know that St. Pachomius was somebody who read the Psalms. Mm-hmm. So I'm just kind of curious when it became more prominent to say the Jesus prayer first as the Psalms. The Psalms I really like, but they take a lot of effort when you first start to read them.
This is very mysterious because the truth be told, St. John Chrysostom talks about the Jesus prayer, which implies that the Jesus prayer goes back to the 4th century. But there's a part where St. Paul in the New Testament says, I'd rather say 5 words with my nous, 5 words with my understanding, than many words.
Okay.
In Greek, Kyrie Jesu Christe, eleison me, there's a view that there's some people who say he's saying the Jesus prayer. He's talking about the Jesus prayer. These 5 words this is what some people claim. When Saint Pachomius uses the Psalms for his disciples, because he predates Saint Benedict in creating a kind of rule governed monastic life. What he oftentimes does, he gives people a verse from the scriptures to completely say over and over again. And so the way his disciples would oftentimes do things is they would take a verse from the Psalms or from the Gospels and they would just repeat it over and over again.
Which
like
okay.
Saint Pachomius, the great, Saint Pachomius, the founder of Cenobitic life. He's not really the founder of Cenobitic life, but he kind of establishes it. He's like Saint Benedict. Saint Benedict creates a rule. Saint Pachomius creates a rule, and these rules were very, 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 very influential. So in a sense, you have people who say the Psalms. They say one verse of the Psalms like, "O Lord, heal my soul, for I've sinned against thee. O Lord, heal my soul, for I've sinned against thee. O Lord, heal my soul, for I've sinned against thee." However, you also men who say the Psalms continuously. Hezekiah can be acquired through the Psalms. It can be acquired through the Jesus prayer. The Jesus prayer is probably easier to do this with, and that's why many people guide people towards the Jesus prayer. They say this because you will actually gain Hezekiah faster through this pattern.
I had a conversation with somebody a few weeks ago, and he had said that you don't need to say the Jesus prayer out loud. You should say it in quiet. To yourself. But the books that I read, it doesn't really say whether you should say it out loud or not. It doesn't matter. He knows our thoughts anyways, correct?
He does. So one thing I'll say is that St. Paisi Valchkovsky, some of the Holy Fathers who really worked to bring back the Jesus prayer, because for a while the Jesus prayer, in a sense, was forgotten by a huge number of people. It was always remembered by monastics, by certain monastics. The Psalter was never lost. It was never forgotten. The Psalter was said always. It was never forgotten. But the Jesus prayer, in particular, went through periods of time in which it was not used as much. It was not said as much. It was forgotten by many people. We can talk more about this, what I mean by this. But basically, St. Paisi Valchkovsky, when he brought this back, he basically said that a lot of stuff about the Jesus prayer was not written down because it didn't need to be. As in what he meant is that the Jesus prayer was so often said in the early centuries, and so many people knew it and practiced it, and finding people who knew it meant that you didn't need to write a bunch of... for example, when you go and read we don't have the Philokalia. When you go and read the Philokalia, which I don't recommend to lay people really, the Philokalia is for people that are highly advanced, like people that are holy, people that live lives of absolute virtue, people that are really good. And so this would talk about the highest aspects of the Jesus prayer. But we don't find a whole lot of books from the Fathers about the lower parts of the Jesus prayer, like the beginning stages of saying the Jesus prayer. And St. Paisios says this is because there were so many people who practiced it, it was so well known, that there wasn't a need for this. The other thing he says is when the Muslims conquered the East, they destroyed a lot of stuff. Yeah. He said a lot was destroyed by the Muslims who conquered the Byzantines, destroyed a lot of their monasteries, burned a lot of books, killed a lot of people. And he says this was because of the sins of Christians that God allowed this to happen, and so a lot was lost. A lot of things were lost at that time. So in terms of saying the Jesus prayer out loud, a lot of fathers would actually say that you should say it out loud. The reason they would say that is you would say it quietly. The reason they say this is that in order to maintain concentration, if you say words with your own lips, so let's say you're focusing on saying this prayer. So what happens is you're saying, "Oh Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy upon me a sinner. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy upon me a sinner." So your mind, you should be focusing your nous, your mind, you should be focusing it on your heart because you want to mean what you're saying. But at the same time, your mind could still wander. But if you're saying it out loud, you give your mind an additional thing to listen to. So your concentration is maintained not only by directing your gaze towards your heart, but also by hearing the words physically. This actually helps you to maintain your concentration. So St. Joseph the Hesychist, one of the greatest recent teachers of the Jesus prayer, actually said you should hear this. He's basically said to his brother, "I want to hear the prayer always out of your mouth. I want to hear it." Now he didn't mean shout it. He said that when I walk past you, like some of his brothers might be working, they might be carpenters, they might be doing something. He said, "I want to be able to walk past you and hear you softly saying it all the time."
Keeps you focused if you can hear it.
Right, and so he says, so what I can say from my own experience is that there's many times in which I can pray silently, but I might lose my concentration because when you're praying silently, it's just with your mind, but what may come in is other thoughts. Now, the more advanced someone becomes in being able to maintain concentration, he won't need to say it verbally anymore. The verbal part will eventually drop away, and all you'll have is just your heart and your mind continually saying this. Maybe not automatically, but you can easily get into the habit of saying it silently. This is fine. But in the beginning, St. Joseph always stressed that you should say it out loud, if you can. And if you're in the presence of other monks, maybe you shouldn't. But by saying it out loud, you help your own concentration to be maintained in a very strong way.
Nous means eye of the sword.
Your nous means your concentration. So what are you concentrating on? Where's your concentration at any given moment? So the nous is the highest part of the soul. Because we have our subconscious, right? Our subconscious is the part of our mind in which a river of thoughts flow through all day long. Oh yeah, that guy I knew in high school, yeah, he was crazy. And then, this car, yeah, we crashed that car. And then your minds are constantly moving through all these crazy things all the time. This is your subconscious. This is not really where your concentration should ever be. Your concentration should actually be in your heart, because your heart gives meaning. Because you can say many things with your mind and not mean them. Right? I can say, hey, the sky is blue. The sky is also black. Well, I don't actually mean that.
It's difficult when you're trying to change your life and walk down a different road. At first, I found that it was really difficult to have that particular type of self-control with your thoughts.
It takes time to grow. And so the fathers don't have illusions. The fathers don't say that you control your thoughts after one day. They say, no.
Yeah.
The continuous repetition helps you to cleanse your mind. So it's not like on one day we can put reins in our mind and take control like a horse. We can't do this. It takes time. And so whether you say the Psalms, whether you say the Jesus prayer, whatever you do, but you do it with continuous repetition, what you begin to do is you begin to guide your mind to the proper place. Your mind begins to go to the proper place, and you can begin to kind of maneuver it to where you want to go into your heart and place it there. And this continuous prayer is what you need to guide yourself there. But you want to focus on the meaning of the prayer, not on fantasies, not on images, not on some of these things. So when you pray, you're not praying to imagine Jesus, you're praying to him. It's like, if you and I are talking right now, do you imagine me? Well, why would you? I'm talking to you. Right? You're talking to me. It's like, yeah, I'm going to look at Father John, I'm also going to imagine him too. It's like, why would you do that? I mean, that makes no sense. You should focus on talking. So don't imagine Christ. Don't imagine him. Don't imagine heaven. Don't imagine these things. Talk instead. You should talk to Christ as if he's here, not, maybe he's here, maybe he's way up there, I'll imagine. It's like, no, don't do this. Just talk to him. Because the problem with fantasies is that fantasies are the way that Satan operates with people. This is the way he operates with us. He creates fantasies in our mind. He either brings back to us memories of the past. It could be sensual, it could be awful memories, it could be, sins, who knows. The devil can create scenarios in which, we have fake wrongs, like, oh, that man, he would wrong me if he had the chance. You have all kinds of things, right? You're constantly being bombarded with fantasies from Satan. Yeah. And so if we make fantasies the locus point of our prayer, we have serious problems, because at a certain point, we won't be able to tell the difference between our prayer and Satan anymore. Whereas what Hezekiah means is no thoughts. And so if you actually talk to real monks will say, when you pray, you should have no thoughts. No good thoughts, no bad thoughts, nothing, except the prayer. And so the monks will even say, Satan will come to you and he'll say, the elder of your monastery is holy. He won't always bring you bad thoughts. He's not always going to bring you lust or anger or hate or these different things. Sometimes while you're trying to pray, he'll come and he'll say, the priest in the monastery sings so beautifully. He serves so well. Why do I care about this? I'm praying. It's like, you know what I'm saying? And so they have to understand that when you pray, you should enter into a state of vigilance, into a state of vigil. Vigil is where, so in the Latin West, they use words like vigilance and vigil to describe the same concept of Hezekiah, as in entering into a state in which you have nothing in your mind except God. No thoughts, no good thoughts, no bad thoughts. There's no thoughts, there's just Christ. Because otherwise, we remain in the tyranny of our thoughts always, 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 always. See, in the Roman Catholic West, eventually after the schism, what happened was a different form of prayer. So they will talk about mental prayer. They will talk about having this very fervent prayer that will involve your emotions, it will involve the heat of your heart, it will involve many of these things, but it will also be built upon fantasies. And the Holy Fathers will say, no, you may never have fantasies. You cannot have fantasies in prayer. Because if you do, you will end up talking to Satan in ways you don't want to. So for example, Ignatius of Loyola, who founds the Jesuits, he talks about a lot of visions that he has. And these visions are really odd, especially if you come from the East. We would read them and say, I'm sorry, I don't buy into this. Well, why wouldn't you? Because we have so many centuries of experience dealing with visions, dealing with prayer, dealing with these things. And so the Holy Fathers, like St. Simeon the New Theologian, he would say, if you follow the path of using images, you will always end up in a state of delusion. You will always end up there. And St. Simeon saw many men go into delusion. In the East, we've seen many monks commit suicide, many monks jump off cliffs, many monks talk to angels, what they thought were angels. There was a great saint of Russia named St. Nikita. He was a monk, actually, in the Caves Monastery. And he fell into delusion. He went to the abbot and he said, I want to go into the deep caves and be by myself and pray. And the abbot didn't want to let him do this, but he pressured the abbot, and the abbot finally said, okay, go. And so he started being alone in the caves. He's like, I'm a great ascetic. And he started praying. And he was very arrogant and he was very unguarded. And pretty soon an angel appeared to him, and the angel said to him, I'm here, I'm going to pray with you. And he said, okay. And the angel said, in fact, I want you to stop praying. I'm going to say all your prayers for you. I'll pray for you. You just read the Old Testament. What about the New Testament? Don't read the New Testament, just read the Old Testament. Only the Old Testament. This continued for quite a while, actually, and Nikita was doing these things. He gained a reputation as being holy. How awful, right? And so these pilgrims would come to him and he would tell them all this stuff. He would tell them stuff from the Old Testament. And actually, some of the fathers began to listen to what he said, and they said, he's saying weird stuff. He's saying heretical stuff. He's saying stuff that isn't true. It's not Christian. And the abbot realized he's in delusion, you know what I mean? And actually, they tried to rip him out of this delusion. He was so damaged by this by this delusion that for a while he couldn't read at all. He had to learn how to read all over again. In fact, he had to learn to, he might have had to learn to talk. It's almost like he had a complete mental collapse of his entire being. His entire spiritual being folded on itself, and he collapsed. But he repented, he came back. In fact, not only this, he actually worshipped Satan. Satan appeared to him as an angel, and he actually worshipped him, I think. And so he fell badly. He fell into blasphemy. He fell into total sacrilege. He fell into bad things. However, he repented of this, and his repentance was so extreme that later he became the bishop of Novgorod. He was actually made a bishop, which is kind of amazing, actually, that they would make a man a bishop who had fallen so badly. But he regained his humility, and he regained his discernment, and he never, of course, made mistakes like that again. The fathers also talk about a lot of exercises. To be honest with you, they talk about breathing exercise with the Jesus prayer. This is something that all the modern fathers have actually said you should not engage in, because breathing exercises are something that you need to be taught by an elder. And so there's been many people who have tried breathing exercise with the Jesus prayer, and they've actually had serious problems. They've had complications. Some of them have even had demonic things happen to them. What the fathers say is that many of these, things like the exercises, these were given in books to be used by men who had elders who practiced this way. And so what they'll say is that if you simply say the Jesus prayer from your heart, you will gain all the benefits that you will need. Some of these advanced practices were meant to be given and used by men who had a spiritual guide who was of a very high level, right? And so that's why a lot of the instructions in the Philakali are not applicable to people like us, because we're not at a level to which we could make use of these instructions in the correct way. They were written by holy people for uses in special schools, i.e. monasteries, to be used under very special conditions. Some of these things are not things that we should give to the people of the world. The people of the world should, with humility, say the Jesus prayer, and they will find massive grace. In Romania, there was an elder who had a peasant come to him. Right? You've heard that some men say the Jesus prayer so much that it becomes automatic. The Jesus prayer recites itself within their hearts all the time. There was an elder in Romania, I think he was a monastic, who had a peasant, some layman, came to him. And this layman was so pious that he said the Psalter all the times, that he had memorized the whole thing. And not only that, the whole Psalter was on repeat within him. As in, it would begin with Psalm 1, blessed is the man who hath not walked in the counsel of the ungodly, all the way to Psalm 150. And this would happen continuously. So in his heart, his inner being, this was not out loud, in his inner being, the Psalter was being chanted 24/7. So he'd lay down to sleep and the Psalms were going in his heart. He'd go to bed, he'd wake up, the Psalms were continuing as he woke up. The perpetual Jesus prayer is a pattern, but this man had the perpetual Psalter going on in his soul. Both the Jesus prayer and the Psalms establish a man. They do. They both do. It's true.
What was that one practice in the way of the pilgrim that was not right?
Well, when I was speaking to Father Joseph from the monastery that I've oftentimes visited, Father Joseph spoke very highly of the way of the pilgrim. It's very, 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 very well beloved by Orthodox people. Yeah. He said this book is good. We give this book as a gift to many people. He said the only part of this book that is troubling is the part where the main guide of the book tells people to imagine their heart. Imagine your heart. Form an image of your heart in your mind. So imagine your heart. No, we shouldn't do this, because this once again is an image that you're forming in your mind that could then lead to things. So Satan could come and bring you images. And so when I was in Romania, we went to this very holy monastery where Elder Cleopa had died. I bought a prayer from there. You know what I mean? And as I was leaving, this elderly monk, he sold us the prayer or whatever, because he was managing the kiosk. And I took the prayer from him, and he's like, well, he knew I was American or whatever, so he was talking to Diana. He was like, he's saying, do you know how to use this? He's like, no images. He's like shaking his prayer. He's like, no images, That's what he's saying to me as I'm leaving. Don't use images, no images, And I'm like, okay, That's good, you know what I mean? And so that's what happened. What you'll find, this is something that's very amazing, is that monasticism is really no different. Whether you go to Serbia, Greece, Lebanon, Russia, does not matter. It's all the same, because the very same books are being used in all of the monasteries. St. John Climacus, Abba Isaac the Syrian, all the same Desert Fathers are being used everywhere. And so our monastic life is fascinating, because different monasteries will have different particular ways they operate their monastery, but the spirituality of Orthodox monastic life is actually, it's kind of monolithic. It is the same wherever you go, right? You go to Mount Athos, it's the same. Athenites tend to be more tough and more intense, but monastic spiritual life is the same everywhere. What that Romanian monk said, some monk in Greece would be like, absolutely, don't you dare have images. And I'd be like, okay, I won't. And if I went to Serbia, they would say the same. And if I went to Russia, they would say, oh my goodness, don't you ever do that. They would be the same, because they've all followed the same system. The same process.
I'm assuming that Zechariah, when he was presented with Mary, already knew, that Mary was blessed, that she was gonna bear God. I
don't know that fully, because Elizabeth says this when the Virgin Mary comes to her pregnant, and John the Baptist, who's inside of her womb, leaps. So Zechariah hasn't had John the Baptist yet. In this point, he doesn't know. I think what the Holy Tradition says is that it's almost like the Spirit of God comes down upon him, and he just takes her by the hand and leads her in. Almost like God, like literally makes him do this almost.
Wait.
So he does this, and he doesn't necessarily fully understand. He may not understand at all what he's doing in this moment, but he does it out of guidance by the Spirit. The Spirit completely overpowers him, and he simply obeys God and does this. And he may not fully understand what he's doing, because the mother of God is older than John the Baptist. John the Baptist and Christ are at the same age. And so therefore, this is many years before, this is like a decade before he and Elizabeth will conceive John the Baptist. So he doesn't know anything about John. I mean, John the Baptist hasn't happened yet either. Okay. So this is very early on. But is Zacharias holy? Yes, he is. The scriptures say he's blameless. He's a righteous man. That's why he's selected for this purpose, because he's good. So the Holy Spirit dwells upon him. And so he takes the Mother of God into the Holy of Holies, because he's probably one of the few high priests that is good. Some of the high priests were not good. If you go back to this period of time, some of them were bad, some of them were political, some of them were taking bribes, some of them were not good. Like look at the high priests who later on killed Christ. Not all high priests are righteous men. They're not all righteous men. Some of them are evil. Zachariah was not. So of all the high priests that could have led her into the Holy of Holies, he's probably the only one that was virtuous enough to do that. That's why God arranged that he would be on. So he wasn't the high priest all the time. He was the high priest. So the priesthood was so big, because Aaron had so many children and they had so many children and whatever, that David created a system of divisions that he talks about in the book of Kings and Chronicles, where it talks about the divisions that David creates so that all the priests would serve, but they would serve in their according to their timetable. And so like at a certain month, Zachariah's family would serve, and then another month, someone else would serve. And so when this happened, he happened to be the high priest on duty when she came, just like he was the high priest who happened to be on duty when she came to bring the baby Jesus to the temple. That's why, for example, when this vision comes to him and he's in the altar offering incense, and all of a sudden the archangel Gabriel's there and he says, "Oh my goodness!" And the angel says, "Okay, it's okay. You're going to have a son." His duty ends. He goes back to his wife, and that's when they have sex and have a child. When he's off duty, he's not in the temple at that time.
I guess the reason why I asked is because didn't you say earlier that bringing anyone who wasn't a high priest into the Holy of Holies is like unheard of?
Absolutely.
So why would he do that?
He did this just under the inspiration of God.
Okay.
Basically, that's what we would say. Like it's like when Isaiah is caught up to the Holy, when he's caught up to heaven, he has visions. God speaks to him and says, "Do this," and he does these things. Or Moses says, "Well, how should I build a tabernacle?" God shows him and says, "Do this." Right? He's under the guidance of the Holy Spirit in this moment, because there's no reason why he would have carried a woman into the Holy of Holies. None, except that it was a direct command from God that overrode the law. It overrode everything.
Was that similar to when David and everyone else is on the run from Saul and they have to...
No, that's a little bit different. In that case, the high priest of that time, who gave David and those men the showbread to eat, did this in mercy. He did this as an act of economia. This is like Old Testament economia. Obviously, that high priest was a man of discernment and prayer. And he could have been legalistic and said, "No way, I'm not giving this bread to you. You can go starve." And David, but that's not what he said. He said, No. You can have some of this. You can have this. So he blessed him, yes. Okay, we got
When does Simeon come in? It's after this, and...
Simeon is alive this entire time. Simeon is absolutely alive. I'm not sure what Simeon is doing at this particular moment, but Simeon is around being holy. I don't know what he is doing.
Yeah,
doing holy things.
Yeah, he's been holy.
Then he prophesied to her, and I thought it had been in the temple. Just my thought.
So Simeon was a priest. Simeon was one of the translators of the Septuagint. And what happened with Simeon was that he had reached that verse in Isaiah where it says, "A virgin shall conceive," and Simeon said, "No way, that's not going to happen." And this angel came and said, "No, it will happen, and you'll live to see it." And so Saint Simeon was like, "Oh, okay." And so then he completed the translation, and then he was there when Christ was born. So he is alive at this point. I'm not sure what he's doing, if he's serving in the temple or if he's just, I don't know if he's in retirement. I don't really know what his life is actually doing at this time.
What scripture were you referring to? When you said he was translating, saw that?
That's not in the. That's the Holy Tradition of Simeon's life.
Oh.
Simeon is a righteous priest. He's a righteous man. But the Gospel of Luke doesn't give that. It says he's a man full of days. He's this like very old man. It doesn't give that backstory. That comes from Holy Tradition.
Okay. But you said that he was a translator
of the Septuagint.
Of the Septuagint.
Yes, of the Old Testament. Yes, he translated the Old Testament from Hebrew to Greek.
Right.
And that's where he had that moment in Isaiah where he encountered...
Right, that's what I was talking
about. That's
when
he encountered... It's Isaiah, I think 7:14, where he encounters this verse, and he basically... It says, "And a virgin shall conceive and bear a son." And he wanted to take his device and, like... It's not white out, because they didn't have that. But it's like he was going to basically cut it off and put "young woman will conceive." And an angel said, "No, Father, you don't say that. You say what's written. Say parthenos, say virgin." And he said, "What?" And the angel said, "Do it, and God will show this to you. You will see this, and you will not depart this life until you have seen it." And that's what he means that's what it means in the Gospel of Luke when he says, "Lord, now let us have thy servant depart in peace, for I have seen your salvation." I've seen what you said you would show me. Because it said it had been revealed to him that he would not depart until he had seen the Lord's Christ. That's what I think what the Gospel of Luke says. And so what it's referring to is this moment that he had when God said to him, the angel said to him, you will see the Lord's Christ. You will see what you are prophesying come to pass. I promise it. God has commanded it. You will see it. And he does. And he's in the temple and he sees the baby Jesus being carried by his virgin mom. And he says, oh, and he comes and grabs. So he was certainly alive at the same time as Zacharias. And he dies naturally, shortly after he, takes Jesus in his arms and blesses God.
I think he also prophesies this to Mary too.
He prophesies that she will suffer. He says, the
Yeah.
sword will pass through your heart as well. And he says that, this child will be for the rising and falling of many in Israel, is what he says, I think, about Christ, the baby Christ. We will see the prophet Simeon when we break out the icon for the meeting of the Lord. That he will see him in this later, but this is not his feast, and so he's not present in this, unless he's also in the temple at this time. But like I said, I don't know what Simeon is up to, outside of this moment. If there's no more questions, then we can move on to whatever else is available.
I just wanted to say, I know I shared this with you when I spoke
Yes.
last night, but
Yes.
it's when I've read the book of Isaiah and Micah and the other prophets, it's baffling on how accurate they were.
Yes.
They were just, it was right down to the
Yes.
place, the time, everything. So when I read that, or if somebody else reads it, and I don't know how people can't believe it.
Yes.
It's like how it was just so accurate. So when I look at it, I just look at it. Well, that's just the only way to look at it,
Well, the Holy Spirit guided all the prophets. The
Yeah.
Holy Spirit guided everyone from the time of Adam until the coming of the Christ, so that the truth would be maintained. And so this was
Yeah.
maintained by the prophets, it was maintained by the Maccabees, it was maintained by righteous men. Some of them were prophets, some of them were not prophets. But it was maintained all the way until this time, the coming of the Christ, the coming of the Mother of God, the coming of all these different things that God had set in order. That is, yeah, absolutely. And so in the case of someone like Saint Simeon, although he was a righteous man, he didn't really understand this verse. Because one thing we have to say about the Jews is that the Jews did not live to see this fulfilled. Now, as Christians looking back, everything is painfully obvious to us.
Yeah.
To the Jews, it was not so obvious. And so someone like Simeon was looking at this saying, what does this mean? Like, I don't know what this verse means. What does this mean? And, an angel said, do not tamper with the scriptures. Do not alter this. Do not change this. Translate this as you need to and do this, and you will live to see it. And he ultimately does. He lives to see it, and this truth is borne out to us.
So you know how the Catholics will have two names, Jean Paul.
Yeah.
Do the Orthodox ever do this, or is it just one saint, one prophet, or whatever?
Well, John Paul, that was after the council. John started it, and John the 23rd died, and they had Paul, and then he took the name after the two that started the Vatican II Council.
Joining the two names together, John Paul.
Oh, I thought you said John Paul. It's yeah.
I did say Jean Paul.
That's how it came out.
I think that's less common. I think in the East it's more common that a person has only one name.
Right.
I think that is more common.
You talking about not taking two patron saints or something?
Typically, though, with my daughter we did. we baptized her Theodora Iliana, so we combined
right.
two names.
Okay.
That's not common. We didn't do that with any of our other children. We probably would not do that again. We had specific reasons why we did that.
Was it related to the specific saint?
Yeah.
Was there
Yes.
a time?
Yes. So therefore, it's not common to do that. To take two saints at baptism. That's actually kind of uncommon. It really is more common to simply say one.
Well, John Paul referred to God as a matriarch. He used all sorts of. John Paul the First and.
Okay.
All those Vatican or something else.
Okay. Yeah. So, I didn't want to go into that. I don't want to go into that. And that's whatever. That's crazy.
What do you think I'm here?
But so the truth is, typically, to be honest with you, I would say typically no. Typically, one name. We had very, very, very intense reasons why we actually did what we did. We would not do it again. We had very special reasons why, because of the relationship we had with both saints that we did that. But that's not really common. And so I would say typically we should probably just have one name. Like, for example, monastics receive only one name,
Yeah.
right? And unless you become of the Great Schema, then you receive a new name, you receive another name, because the Great Schema is considered even more intense than monasticism, so you enter into this other condition.
The great what?
The Great Schema is the final level of monastic life. It's the highest level.
Oh.
And so you might take
Like
another
a
name.
super monk?
Yeah, more or less, actually. And so in the Russian church, if a man takes the Great Schema, he goes into reclusion. He actually goes by himself. He no longer lives with the brotherhood anymore. He goes into reclusion.
At St. Herman's, I was blessed to see one of the
Yeah.
monks, and but he was there pretty much every service.
Oh, he was still coming to church, but
Yeah,
he might not agree. He might not deal with pilgrims much anymore.
Yeah,
Anyway, when a man takes the Great Schema, he'll receive another name. So he'll receive a new name. When a man becomes a monk, he receives and a name different from his baptismal name. Paul receives a new name. Paul is Saul, right? He goes from being Paul to Saul. Peter is never really called Simon much anymore. Like, we really know him as Peter, right? We know him as Simon Peter. We might say that to recognize the fact that he had another name, but in the church he really is called Peter, right? This is the name Christ gives to him. And so there is a sense in which Christ does rename some of the apostles. Yeah. He gives them these new names. Not all of them necessarily, but some of them receive new names, like Peter and certainly Paul receives a new name. Mm-hmm. Paul goes from being Saul to being least. Paul is humble, so he calls himself least.
Paulos means like little, humble.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so Paul takes this name. But, to be honest with you, if you already have a Christian name coming into the church, then I do not think that it is a bad thing to keep it, actually. Yeah. If you're already named for a saint, if you're already named for an apostle, if you already have these kinds of names, certainly you can say, well, I want a new name. So, okay, I would grant that, but it's like, if you already have the name of someone who's holy, then it's good, to not change it, actually, I would say. This is my opinion. And sometimes, if you're saying the Jesus prayer, you can say the Jesus prayer standing. Some people can maintain their concentration while standing. Some people sit to maintain their concentration. Sitting is not what we would call a premier condition of reverence. The reason it's adopted is to maintain the concentration, so the concentration can be maintained. Because if you stand on your knees, if you kneel and kneel before God and you try to say the Jesus prayer for 5 hours on your knees, pretty soon you won't be able to concentrate anymore because your knees will ache. So kneeling is a posture that is very important. It's very good. But kneeling is not a posture you can maintain endlessly for long periods of time. And so when you kneel, you should say something specific, like, I need to talk to God in a very specific way, and you kneel and you say this prayer. But then if you have to pray, if you're intending to pray for a long time, you should not assume a posture like kneeling, because kneeling will be unmanageable. You will not be able to maintain this posture for long periods of time. And so either standing is a good posture to maintain. This is kind of what we call normative posture. It's reverent posture. Kneeling is ultra-reverent posture, but that is a hard posture to keep for hours. So many of the monks will pray for hours. And of course, if you do prostrations, this actually will break up the monotony of your standing, but it will also be an act of reverence too, of great reverence and great humility. And so the typical posture is standing. But some monks will assume a position of sitting to say the Jesus prayer in an intense way. But they will also do many prostrations. So it's not like they're being lazy. It's that for the necessity of having deep concentration, they will sit for a while and say the Jesus prayer. And then they will also, do prostrations, do bows. Because we should show reverence to God physically too. Just like we were saying with physical actions, we should demonstrate physical reverence to God. And that's important.
I know the Russians have a prayer mat. They use sometimes. I've only seen
lots of people do.
I'm sure
that
other
churches.
Yeah. But is that for kneeling and?
Yeah. Or for doing prostrations.
Prostrations too.
What I'll say to you is I know that in the Muslim world, Muslims will do prostrations when they do prayers, and there's a lot of Muslims who they really like to show off the fact that they have a bump on their head because they slam their head against the concrete endlessly. But I'm going to tell you what, in the Orthodox world, we don't do that. So no one should ever know that you do prostrations. Yeah. And so the monks will do prostrations on a carpet, even in Manathos, so that no one will ever know that they do prostrations. Because if you did prostrations all the time and your face is banged up from all your prostrations, everyone will be like, if you look at how holy he is. It's like, no, no one wants that. Because then you lose all the things you did. Mm-hmm. So you want anyone to know. That's why Christ says, if you're going to go pray, if you're going to go fast, go paint your face with oil, anoint your face, and comb your hair, look really good, so no one will think you're fasting. They'll think you're just like some posh, ridiculous fop. But in the meantime, you're in your secret place, you're doing all these prostrations and doing intense things, but on the outside, no one would know that. They would never think that way. So among others, they definitely try not to show off anything. They try not to let no one know this.
It seems like it'd be hard to maintain with all the thousands of prostrations, but
they maintain. They do. Monks know that they're doing prostrations. They know that about each other. Right. They all know this, but they don't make a big deal out of this. Any more questions? No more. So are you satisfied about this feast? Is there anything about this you want to know that you don't know?
When do you sign up to be a United States monk corps?
You can go talk to the monks about that.
Right.
As a parish priest, I don't really sign anyone up for monastic life. You can go to the monastery and ask them about joining the monastic life. But as a parish priest, I can make recommendations, but I can't tonsure anyone. I can marry people because I'm married, but I can't tonsure a monk because I'm not a monk. So there is a tradition that monastics should not marry people. That can be completely avoided based on necessity, because sometimes monks are even sent to parishes to serve. But there is a tradition that would say if you're a celibate priest, you ought not do marriages. The married priest should. Just like married priests cannot tonsure anyone into monastic life. They don't have this power. They don't have this grace, so they can't give it. However, this rule that I just mentioned about monastics and marriage is not really followed. Monastic priests can perform marriages. Bishops absolutely perform marriages. They are the premier performer of marriages. And so any priest can perform a marriage. But it's not common for people to go to a monastery to get married. It just is not really common. All right, guys. It is truly meet to all be blessed, and blessed, and all immaculate, and Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and beyond compare more glorious than the seraphim. Thee, who without corruption gave us birth to God the Word, the very Theotokos. Thee do we magnify. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, both now and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen. Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy. God is with us by his grace and love for mankind, always, now, and ever, and unto the ages of ages. Amen.